Hello, hello.
Hello, Brandon. Thank you for being here. We are now at the Museum of Contemporary Art of Santiago in the listening assembly sessions of the Resonant Spaces Festival. Um, I think that usually at this hour, maybe it's difficult to have public to come or people here also come a little bit late, but I think for also that you're waiting and all, it's better if we start and and we can talk later about your presentation uh, with the artists and the people who are here now.
Okay, yeah,
I
that
will
sounds fine.
I will make an introduction of you. We are now also being streamed live in the YouTube channel. I will make an introduction in Spanish. Okay. Um, Brandon LaBelle es un artista, escritor y teórico que vive en Berlín. Su trabajo se centra en cuestiones de agencia, comunidad, cultura pirata y poética, lo que da como resultado una serie de iniciativas colaborativas y parainstitucionales que incluyen The Listening Biennial and Academy, Communities in Movement, The Living School, Oficina de Autonomía, The Imaginary Republic, Dirty Ear Forum, Surface Tension, and Beyond Music Sound Festival. En 1995 fundó Erran Bodies Press, un proyecto editorial independiente que apoya el trabajo y los estudios de arte sonoro, la performance y la poética, la investigación artística y el pensamiento político contemporáneo. Sus publicaciones incluyen The Other Citizen, Sonic Agency, Lexicon of the Mouth, Acoustic Territories y Background Noise. Su último libro, Acoustic Justice, aboga por un modelo acústico mediante el cual abordar cuestiones de igualdad social. Brandon, it's an honor to have you here. We are very happy that you are joining us in this project and also to hear about your last work on acoustic justice, which I think is very related to the festival we are doing right now, Espacios Resonantes. Please, now you can.
Yes, thanks a lot, Matthias. Um, I would have liked to have been there personally. It sounds like a fantastic undertaking and festival, so I hope everything is going well. And no, really, I'm happy to be here, so thanks for the invitation. Um, yes, I thought for today I was going to concentrate on kind of mapping out the notion of acoustic justice, which I've been focusing on in recent years. And I hope this can provide some input, of course, into the situation there and everything that you're working on together. So please, if there's any questions at the end or you want to discuss any aspects, I'm very open to doing that. So I could maybe, yeah, just start with some first reflections or contexts. I guess for myself, the notion of acoustic justice is really fueled or figured by an overarching recognition or understanding of the importance of hearing and being heard. So the sort of the relevance or the urgency, the dynamics around that importance of hearing and being heard, we know is really so necessary for realizing forms of social recognition. Well, I guess I'm sort of motivated by this general sense of urgency, this general understanding of how important hearing and being heard is to really support a sense of recognition, to support a sense of participation in whatever context or community we find ourselves in. And the ways in which we work at that process or that urgency, the way that we work at hearing and being heard as a process of recognition is really, yeah, central to my focus and my inquiries. So social recognition is really present there as a focus, as a question. But then alongside that, I'm also interested in how hearing and being heard, and also what we will start to talk about as acoustics, how that is also really supportive of urgencies and also the joys around communal efforts. you know? So, not only to do with social recognition in terms of maybe how we communicate, how we engage in forms of language or institutional work, but also questions of maybe what we could think of as resonance, sort of social resonances, which are more to do with, again, the joys, the urgencies, the engagements we undertake, maybe on a more affective level when we come together and we work together and we exchange, we undertake forms of communal effort. And maybe these are things that are taking place there at the festival as well, you know, coming together in a special context to really move something in ourselves and with each other. Um, so these two aspects, maybe for me, social recognition and also social resonance, moving from the importance of hearing and being heard to also more affective and embodied relationalities, to feeling also that we participate in something greater than ourselves. Um, so these two things are really central to acoustic justice as a project. Um, Now, this kind of entails a focus on acoustics. So I'm going to talk through acoustics for today in this more sort of social relational sense. Um, to consider the movements and expressions of recognition and resonance, but also in a way, acoustics allows us to, or maybe it invites us to shift from a concentration on the production of a sound, if we think of the sound object as a central focus, toward more thinking around the conditions that allow hearing and being heard to take place. So thinking of acoustics more to do with context, more to do with the conditions that enable sound to occur. Yeah. So the question might be what gestures, what constructions, what arrangements can be made to enable the movement of particular sounds, especially when it comes to extending the arena of what or who is heard. So, in other words, in what way do we care for acoustics? And in doing so, care for the circulation of a diversity of views and voices. So, again, how do we care for acoustics in order to support social recognition and resonance to take place? So, these are sort of some of my primary questions. So, maybe going back a little bit of a step, to think again, what do we mean by acoustics? Of course, acoustics is primarily and often thought about as a design practice within the field of architecture, within the field of spatial design or urban planning. So, acoustics very much as the shaping of a sound environment. Um, So, this is, of course, unfolded or developed through particular strategies, particular skills, particular analysis of architectures and environments. So acoustics, of course, is always already a question of space and environments. It's also a question of material work and a certain kind of engagement with the materialities around us that really are embedded and that are existing within the places that we occupy. So often intervening with material or technical adjustments on an acoustic level, often related to questions of noise, echo, vibration. So these are sort of primary sort of perspectives or approaches on an acoustic level that we might say reveals acoustics as that which works at producing a particular sonic image or maybe a particular sonic signature, what we can, of course, think about as a room tonality. So, acoustics as the production of a room tonality. uh, And I really want to think about that room tonality on a social level, on a political level, on an affective level. How do we move in and through various room tonalities? What do those room tonalities enable? What do they support? What do they hinder or obscure? So we want to think through room tonalities as that which sort of emerges within a kind of acoustic framework. So here, of course, I want to immediately suggest that acoustics is implicated in enabling the movement or propagation of particular sounds, allowing certain sounds to be heard more than others. It therefore can be said to apply or reinforce certain acoustic norms, you know, or kind of the values that are sort of embedded behind acoustical work. If we think of acoustics as that which goes in and shapes a particular sound environment, maybe responds to an existing environment or architecture through a set of material adjustments, what is driving those decisions in a sense? Can we sort of unpack those or interrogate those acoustic decisions in terms of the values that they support? So, for instance, we can ask ourselves what counts as good sound or deviant or even dirty sound. So, following these kind of perspectives, these immediate kind of reflections, we can start to think about acoustics as the distribution of the herd. We follow the work of Jacques Rancière and his political theory around the distribution of the sensible, the ways in which the political is the partitioning and the distribution of that which appears before us, whether that's a voice, whether that's a body, whether that's the circulation of opinions. So here I'm kind of borrowing from Rancière and thinking around the distribution of the herd in terms of what we hear in environments. Thinking acoustics is that which impacts and shapes that distribution. So here we could say that I'm moving towards a certain politicization of acoustics, maybe in a way to put acoustics into question or to put it to work on various levels. So, of course, here this is maybe driven by, again, the fundamental recognition of how acoustics is implicated within not only architectures and material work, but therefore it's also implicated in processes of socialization and sociability. Who or what are we sort of coming into contact with, and how and in what way do we gain access to participating in particular communities, or feeling a sense that we may enter and develop a sense of belonging? So here, again, the question is what kinds of acoustic norms are in place? What kinds of also maybe acoustic economies are in place, shaping again what voices are heard and what are not? So here we can maybe think through an example. For instance, if we look at concert hall design, which is a very pronounced acoustic space, a very pronounced form of acoustic architecture, the designing of concert or music halls. Um, and here I'm staying primarily within a somewhat European context of kind of classical music concert design. Um, and here we can think about two terms or two topics that come up within a certain kind of acoustic process or acoustic design work, and that is fidelity and reflection. So if we can think about, for instance, fidelity, which is understood as, well, we could maybe pose it as the staying true to particular sounds. Yeah. So, the staying true to particular sounds within a concert hall setting is, of course, to bring concentration and focus to the musical work, to the particular instrumentation, to the production of a sound from the stage, and how that sound then is given support or is able to be heard throughout the sort of architectural setting. You know? So within that moment, you could say, of acoustic design within a concert hall setting, there is a sort of attempt, a sort of demand, or an engagement with the ability to develop or to sustain a sense of clarity. One has to hear those instruments in a clear fashion. If I'm sitting way in the back of the concert hall, I have to also still hear those instruments in a clear fashion. At the same time, much acoustic work strives also for a sense of immersion, a sense of intensity that one is also immersed in that musical experience. So those two things, that sense of clarity, reducing distortion, achieving a certain balance across the instruments and sounds, while also giving us a feeling of immersion. These are things that are sort of aimed for within the process of acoustic design. So this is also somewhat of a challenge to achieve clarity and immersion at the same time. So in doing so, there's been a sort of general acoustic norm of establishing a 2-second reverberation time. mm, within a kind of European concert hall setting. This is a sort of standard, you could say, in order to achieve clarity and immersion. Again, fidelity, staying true to certain sounds. So, in doing so, we can also start to sort of question in what way those 2 seconds of reverberation establish particular listening habits. So, if one was to sort of have more than 2 seconds or a greater sense of immersion, this may start to produce what we can think of as dirty sound, or can be thought to be not as clear and therefore more noisy. So these again, what I'm aiming for is to recognize in what ways acoustics carry certain values, follow certain kind of normative patterns, and therefore in doing so really impacts on our listening habits to establish what we can think of as acoustic communities. So, for instance, those communities that gravitate around, for instance, classical music, or that gravitate around those particular kind of musical environments, and therefore really establish a set of standards or a set of habits in terms of what we come to expect from sound or what we come to expect from our musical experience. And we know very well that once you start sort of leaving the concert hall and seeking out other kinds of architectures, other, for instance, within the field of sound art, which is often, a practice that aims for sort of unconventional locations, sort of often spaces with unique reverberations, with unique material situations, and really, in a way, appreciates those dynamics as interesting and as, again, sort of that which kind of breaks our normative kind of listening habits and invites us into something else. So, again, we can see on an acoustic level how acoustics is implicated within these processes without at times not necessarily being focused on or addressed. So I'm sort of just looking to bring attention to acoustics in that sense to really appreciate and recognize how it's at work and developing these kind of room tonalities that then produce certain kinds of listening habits. And of course, given that, also giving way to opportunities to hear something unexpected or to extend and expand what we know listening to be. So, how do we also work at acoustics? How might we think of acoustics also as a practice or even as a performativity? So this raises maybe the question, which is, how do we come to hear beyond a certain acoustic norm? or sort of what we can think of as a dominant tonality. What sort of invites us to hear beyond that, to encounter noises that are sort of inviting us to relating otherwise to our environments. So, in that sense, I really want to think acoustics also not only as a design practice, but as a performativity. If we follow, sort of the thinking around Judith Butler and her notions of identity or gender performativity, and sort of take that sense of performativity and bring that into the realm of acoustics and into questions of sound and listening. So, acoustic performativity might sort of highlight or ask, how subjectivity or even how communities work through the conditions of power through acoustic means, or maybe even an acoustic craft. And in doing so, through that acoustic performativity, they come to sort of modulate the distribution of the herd, kind of impacting on that distribution, maybe giving way to other sounds to be heard, other voices to circulate, other listening habits or experiences to emerge. So we might say then that acoustic communities and maybe also acoustic commons emerge by way of this acoustic performativity that work across acoustic norms, shifting understandings, or the dynamics of fidelity. Again, what sounds do we want to stay true to? What sounds are we aligning ourselves with? So, impacting on that through a kind of acoustic performative, I think can sort of support ways of coming together, ways of addressing each other, ways of encountering and experiencing, something that we may want to support. So also maybe things that you are also working on there, I can imagine might also be sort of um, relating to what I'm talking about. So then, to kind of continue with this idea of acoustic performativity, we can think around, well, what would be sort of elements of an acoustic practice? If we think again, taking acoustics outside of the sort of professionalized arena of science and architecture and urban planning, and to think it more on a everyday level. What are the kind of acoustic gestures or arrangements we make to kind of impact on that distribution of the herd? So I'm just going to go through a set of frameworks or modalities that can kind of maybe open up what I'm talking about with acoustic practice. So here we can start immediately with questions of silence and noise, yes, which are kind of fundamental questions, fundamental issues and experiences within our environments. How we contend with the noise of others, for instance. And here we can think already that uh, silence and noise introduces a question of volume, and we can think volume both in terms of the loudness of a sound, but also in terms of a spatial volume. So if maybe some of you, still have stereos with knobs, I don't know, or maybe some of you are, tapping on things, but this moment of raising or lowering volume, yeah, this gesture reaching down and turning up volume, turning it down on various devices, for instance. This is already to shift the dynamics of what we're hearing. So, this is already suggesting a kind of acoustic practice. Again, in terms of when I turn something up, I'm hearing more, but I'm also extending or impacting on those kind of spatial architectural volumes that surround us. So I'm filling a room with sound when I turn something up. And then, of course, when I quiet down, I'm sort of, shifting the dynamic or shifting the presence of what we hear to possibly also allow for other things to come in. So silence and noise as the modulation of volume, a making quiet or an intensifying of the heard. These are maybe instances that can also intervene or again sort of nuance existing acoustic dynamics, existing dominant tonalities. We can, of course, think about instances of social uprising as a very extreme moment of raising volume to, in this case, produce another kind of tonality to maybe also interrupt or break an existing dominant uh, acoustic norm, for example. So here we start maybe thinking around acoustics, and we can continue by shifting also to the topic of rhythm. We can think rhythm as an acoustic practice. So, of course, one way to think about rhythm is what we can say as the establishment of a pattern. Rhythm as an establishment of a pattern. It sort of sets into place a given sense of timing. Yes, rhythm as timing, a keeping time, a being in time, that then lends itself to forms of repetition. If we think again of rhythm as a form of synchronization, of falling in line with existing patterns, of taking a place within certain structures that really define how we move through time. Uh, Maybe we have a sense for this even again within our everyday experiences of sort of being on time for certain things and how those sort of time signatures, those temporal structures, also define how we move through our environments. Mhm. Rhythm is also setting pace to our movements. So I think we can start to sort of approach rhythm again as an acoustic practice if we think about how we also work at establishing our own rhythms, how we sort of negotiate existing patterns, how we also synchronize with those patterns and also desynchronize, how we also break away and undertake our own sort of detours or digressions or alternative patterns. So we work at rhythm, I think, in very fundamental ways, setting pace again to our own lives, maybe, and the relationships that we lead. So maybe rhythm can also raise the question, what does it mean to be in or on time? And what kind of time are we keeping, yes, with our rhythms? And so following from rhythm, then we can maybe start to move into questions of vibration, yes, extending our vocabulary of acoustic practices. And vibration, I like to think of vibration as an ecology of feeling, yeah, an ecology of feeling. Again, maybe if we go back to tonality, to think about the tonality of places, yeah, that maybe also vibration is about atmosphere or ambience. And we have this sense, of places having an atmosphere, of having an ambient quality. We express this around the notion of places having good or bad vibes. For example, on a kind of affective sense of feeling. How do I feel when I enter this place? Is this a place that welcomes me? Do I feel comfortable here? So maybe we can think this on a vibrational level, again, as a tonality, a sensation of place, um, that in a way really impacts also on how we feel and how we engage with others. So, this ecology of feeling, I think, is also something that we craft and we create in our everyday environments. Probably even in the festival there, creating this space today, maybe also had a sense for how to welcome listeners, how to create a communal situation. How do we occupy this space? How do we situate ourselves there? So I think vibration can also be very much about hospitality, about producing forms of hospitality in the construction of these ecologies of feeling that can really impact, I think, again, on how we come to relate to each other. And here I just want to introduce a sort of argument in relation to uh, the notion of sonic warfare that is sort of articulated by Steve Goodman and others. Work that, of course, is also very important and I fully learn from. But this question of sonic warfare as, for instance, a vibrational war zone, yeah, a kind of base battle that Goodman articulates in a very expressive manner. This politics of frequency that Goodman gets at, understanding it as a form of sonic warfare, as a scene of conflict. I also want to complement that by thinking vibration not only as a base battle or a sonic warfare, but also as something we could call acoustic welfare or acoustic care. So, to complement that, to think about acoustics also as a care work, as a work of hospitality that also aims at healing wounds or fostering diplomacy, an ecology of feeling that supports also forms of participation. So, and maybe also protection. If we think about ecologies of feeling also as safe spaces, sometimes that we make, to support and protect those that are together. So, this is how I'd like to think vibration as an acoustic practice. And then on top of that, we can finish by thinking about echo as an acoustic practice. Now, echo, of course, can be thought about in different ways, but I like to approach it through an idea of language and language performativity. If we sort of ask ourselves, how do we learn language? How does one enter and adopt and learn another language? This, of course, happens primarily through listening to others speak and trying to repeat words. So if I was to ask you, how do I say something in Spanish? You would, of course, say it, and I would simply try to repeat it. So this echo is fundamentally behind the acquisition of language, which I also think sort of never really stops. I think we are always learning how to speak and learning new languages as we go. So we are also always listening out for guidance and for those voices that also give us something and that we might take for ourselves and repeat, or in a way put it into our own language, our own voice, our own mouth, and allow it to kind of reside there, to give way to one's own voice. So, echo is about kind of enactment and reenactment. It's about listening out and taking in and then playing back. It's a process of bringing in and finding oneself through that which we hear to also differentiate ourselves. So, echo isn't always simply repetition, it isn't a perfect playback. It's a repetition that isn't quite the same. And so, it's a repetition and a difference. So, here we could maybe think about a critical echo, a critical echo that also helps us, for instance, disagree, you know, or to offer a counter argument, you to what we hear. So I think echo, again, we might think this as this performativity, as this acoustic practice that listens out into its environment, and in doing so also helps us play back or to disagree or to work or participate in a larger public sphere. So these are kind of aspects that I'm thinking about in terms of acoustics, acoustic performativity. Again, to think how those practices are modulating the distribution of what we hear, kind of intervening and supporting our capacity to hear and to be heard. And maybe in doing that, we could think it also sort of engages with those room tonalities and attunes or retunes our environments, shifting the sort of distribution or even politics of frequency and that which is being given support. So we can maybe ask ourselves, if we think about our environments, how might we consider how acoustics participates or contributes, for instance, to scenes of democracy or even education, these larger environments, in which, the it's so sort of fundamentally important in terms of how we speak and hear each other. What types of acoustic decisions or even acoustic economies come to define these places that we pass through or inhabit? We can even maybe think that in the context of artistic environments as well, such as museums. So I want to kind of think again, what kind of acoustic arrangements do we make to facilitate, for instance, the coming together of people, the process of hearing and being heard, that can maybe also nurture forms of intimacy, learning, and also care, or even sort of help engage with a process of social recognition, for instance. How might we begin to think those as acoustic questions, as acoustic operations? So here then I kind of want to, also shift. We had talked about a little bit at the beginning about how acoustics also invites us to extend our concentration, extend our attention not only to the sound object itself, to the event of a particular sound, but also to the context and conditions that allow that sound to occur or that give support or traction to particular voices. And in doing so, kind of moving from the sound object to the kind of acoustic arena, it also sort of invites us to shift from questions of hearing to orientation. And so we can also expand the conversation, I think, to include hearing, to address questions of listening, but also a broader sense about orientation, how it is that acoustics orients us within our environments. Again, what sounds or what voices do we hear, and how do those voices gain traction within certain environments, and therefore allow one to synchronize or align or affiliate with those voices? These all become questions of orientation. And of course, orientation then helps us understand listening in a very broad sense, to also include what I've been mapping out in terms of vibration, ecologies of feeling, to include a sense of rhythm, which is really ultimately a question of time and movement, and also to issues of echo, which are also about language performativity, but also gestures and a sense about how we respond to our environments, a sense of responsiveness that is driven by way of processes of echo. So all these things, I think, try to expand the frame of our sound studies, of our concentration on hearing and listening. So I kind of want to sort of contribute to that discussion, thinking around orientation, and also finally around this notion of acoustic justice, which is to say, again, how do we work at acoustics in order to impact on to the distribution of the herd, to open up possibilities for certain voices to be heard, to circulate, to find support, and also to care for those relational economies, those relational performativities that really underpin communal effort and the possibility of imagining how we may live and work together. So, to find partnerships and companionships along certain rhythmic or vibrational lines, to craft ways of being together. So, these sort of start to introduce a notion of acoustic justice um, that I think, of course, we can discuss and talk further about, but ultimately to think again, going back to the beginning, about the importance of hearing and being heard that really underpins social recognition and the sense of participation that we may have, that also extends not only in terms of how we communicate, how we participate in language, how we work at institutional structures, but also on a very fundamental, embodied, affective level, also about the joy of being together and the urgencies around crafting our collective environments that lend to a certain sense of social resonance. And so, again, to move from social recognition to social resonance that also really help us work at a sense of justice in terms of giving space and giving possibility for kind of collective processes of togetherness. Um, Here we can move from a kind of micro politics in terms of subjectivity, in terms of thinking around our immediate relations, how we experience a sense of being heard and of hearing others, and then move to a sense of the macro political in terms of addressing our institutional environments. For instance, we might think about the courtroom and those kind of legal processes that work at justice, and how these are really somehow related and afforded or somehow enlivened through processes of hearing. Law, of course, is greatly shaped by an acoustic imagination and impacts on how we come to understand rights. If we think about, the institution of law, the space of the courtroom as an acoustic arena that is really sort of um, driven by processes of hearing and being heard, vocalizing and giving attention to, and those kind of processes really need time and space if they're going to arrive at forms of justice, form of judgment that support social equalities. So these things, of course, the micro political to the macro political, really involve acoustics on a great level. And again, if we think acoustic justice also as something that can help us not only support what we can think of as the right to free speech, the right to being able to speak out, but also what we can think of as the right to listen. So we might also start to think about the right to listen as something that acoustic justice and a kind of acoustic model can really help us appreciate. And what might that be, the right to listen? This is, of course, a kind of imaginary, something that we have to, maybe we can carry that with us. Maybe I invite you to carry that with you into the festival and to think through what that might be in the context of Santiago, in the context of your own conversations. But ultimately, I hope it can lend to a sense of, again, sort of caring for our acoustic arrangements and caring for how we work and support diverse forms of orientation. If we think about those orientations as social, bodily, sexual, linguistic orientations that can kind of afford a diversification of possibilities for orienting and also reorienting ourselves within our environments. So I'm gonna. Hello,
Brandon, hello.
Matthias.
We lost you in the best
You hear
part.
me okay? Yeah. All right.
Yes,
Sorry about
sir.
that.
Yeah, we don't know what happened.
Yeah. No, it's okay.
It's it happens a lot in these
Yeah,
kind of situations.
yeah. No, it's true. Okay, we try our best.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
But I think
Sorry.
I think I made it to the end though. I think I
No, you were just like concluding and then it stopped. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you can like just to have like this last moment to say the last sentence and then we can open for questions if that's all right with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I can try to find my way back. Um, but yeah, essentially I was just trying to conclude, around this notion of acoustic justice, to think around the micro political and the macro political on that level, to think how it moves, across those two registers or those levels, and to think around this notion of extending our understanding of rights to that of the right to listen. So kind of using that as like an invitation to imagine like what that could be and how we might figure that within a kind of model of acoustic justice. So I think I was talking around those things. So I think if you got that, then maybe you got the conclusion. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah.
It's been really interesting and really nice to hear. I want to read the book now. Um,
Sure. Okay, sure.
we would
Well,
like to open some questions to the artist, the public that is here. If, okay.
sure.
Um, does anyone want to make a question or commentary? Um, some.
Hi, hi, Brandon. It's Seth Cluitt. Um, so, early in your talk, you made a point to suggest that European concert hall acoustics is about fidelity. And the thing that sort of comes to mind for me is actually that almost all instances of architectural amplification are actually about distortion, right? So that instead of fidelity to the original sound-making object, they distort or enlargen the, the thing being amplified. And this makes me think a little bit about the change in acoustics in cathedrals between the just before and just after the Protestant Reformation. That you have a cathedral that, saturates the people who don't speak Latin in the sounds of God, and then with the Reformation, you get tapestries and things that make the German language audible to the parish. And so in this way, I think with public address systems also, that dictators are allowed to amplify their voices to the sublime. And so to a certain extent, I might argue quite opposite to fidelity, that that amplification serves to create a sense of the sublime from the ordinary, that the small person can sound large and command many people through that amplification. And I'd just be curious, does that run counter to your sense of fidelity, or is there a way to read through that that is coherent?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments, and absolutely, they also kind of contribute to thinking around acoustics on this level. So I'm certainly very open, to thinking or to kind of thinking different versions of fidelity or different versions of the ways in which acoustics is put to work, for exactly what you're you're pointing at for different particular ideologies or for enhancing particular messages, and of course, participating within expressions of power. So I think, all those things that you beautifully point to certainly contribute to that, that realization or that appreciation. Maybe in that sense, to think again or to raise the question of acoustics as a form of politics, as an arena of political work or conflict or process. So, in terms of the particularities around fidelity, uh, I mean, I guess I wouldn't be so. I mean, it's not really about being being sort of challenged to think around that, but to follow what you're saying and to think that amplification, still maybe on some level, it's a question of, well, what are we bringing attention to? So if there is a sound present within a given environment and we sort of work at setting up a kind of acoustic apparatus to enhance or to bring it further attention to that source of sound or that single voice. This is also a little bit of a question of partitioning out and defining, in a sense, where we want to put attention to. So whether that's staying true to to the origins of what we hear through processes of amplification, we might still think this, around a question of fidelity. But I'm not, I'm not committed to arguing for a particular or narrowing down what fidelity might mean. But again, thank you for your comments, Seth.
To assess the relationship between these that you have mentioned, the right to be heard and the right to listen, with what Lafebvre calls the right to the city, and the city as a privileged site for citizen construction, in terms of how it's a privileged site to build the so-called public sphere, right? So how it connects the right to the city with everything you have shared with us today about the right to listen and the right to be heard.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your question. I mean, certainly it's a very important and also complex and challenging question. So I could only say from the beginning that I think it would require, more time. Also, it would be wonderful if I could sit next to you and see your face and have a sort of that acoustic space of conversation to really enable a better reflection, which I've, especially with such a dynamic question. So just to start with that, um, as I sit here in my bedroom in Berlin, trying to relate to Santiago and what the right to the city might be in that context. Um, so I guess on a kind of general level, of course, we can think these two things together. Um, and I mean, like for instance, I was very struck um, and I sort of opened the Acoustic Justice book project with this reflection about the uprisings in Beirut in October 2019, which of course coincided with things happening in Santiago or across Chile. But that moment in Beirut, was a kind of an interesting moment. And of course, it's not so different from other instances that we can identify or kind of examples of social uprising. But one of the things that was sort of so um, sort of present, at least in my experience from a distance of that, was the ways in which kind of this sort of social groups came forward, really trying to address and interrupt and intervene within exactly this kind of question about the sort of acoustic scape or the kind of sound environment of the city of Beirut being one that is very much dominated or has been dominated by particular voices, yeah, the voices of the elite, which occupy all the kind of media, sort of established and controlled media channels, and really come to define, in so many different ways, the experiences people have of what it means to, enter into a sense of citizenship. So the city itself is shaped on an acoustic level by controlling, the voices that are heard and the possibilities of hearing otherwise. And, in that moment of uprising, it was very much conscious of that fact. And there was a number of statements made on the part of protesters, to really particularly target that sense of acoustics to allow for the reverberation of other voices, the sort of extension of, the spectrum of what we hear. And they talked about this as the open mic revolution. So to literally extend the public sphere as a question of having a kind of acoustic apparatus or a sort of media apparatus, which of course on that level was also a metaphor for allowing the city to, resound with a multiplicity of views that previously are never heard. So here we can maybe immediately find a relationship between the right to the city and the right to be heard or the right to listen. Because I think in many ways it wasn't only about suddenly having this moment or this break within the kind of normative structure of giving voice to particular views. It was actually on the level that people finally could hear other voices. So I think there was a wonderful sense of, hearing, just simply hearing other voices rather than the sort of normalized uh, voices of elite politicians and community leaders. So I was very struck by that, those expressions that were so powerful and so touching. Um, so I just pointed that as a kind of example, just to kind of support a little bit even what you're posing, just to sort of understand a relationship being present that impacts precisely on what you're pointing at, which is how do we conceptualize and how do we enact and how do we perform a very notion of citizenship and the ways in which acoustics, for instance, or an idea of the right to listen might impact on that or support that. So again, I think I can only really gesture towards your question, and again, would really appreciate another space and time to share in that as a sort of collective thinking together. Uh, so thanks.
Thank you, Brandon. Yes, it's true. We wait for the moment to be here in Santiago or in other place to talk together and face to face. I hope in another version of the festival. And we need to continue to our next activity. So I will have to say thank you very much, Brandon, for your lecture and for your ideas that you share with us here today. And I hope that we can, for sure we will be talking about this today with the group of people and during next days in the festival. So thank you very much for all the lecture and the ideas.
Thank you, Matthias. Thanks for having me.
Perfecto. Gracias. Ahora vamos a pasar a la actividad dirigida por Alex Arteaga, Frame Dialogue.
Aló.
Hola a todos. Hello everyone. Para todos, mientras organizamos el conversatorio, los invito a la sala que está junto a esta, donde hay café, juguito y algunas cosas para picar. Y hacemos un pequeño break de 5 minutos para ordenar las cosas. I am telling people that we are going to make a little break so we can organize everything. And next door there's some coffee use and some things to eat, so you can do a little break and in the meanwhile. Thank you.